Welcome to First Answers. This is episode 1 in the series, Instead of Divorce, Try This. Instead of being numbered among the rising tide of those who get divorced, learn proven methods in this series of avoiding or solving serious relationship problems. In this episode, learn some of the principal causes of divorce and a few preliminary things couples can do to avoid them. Visit firstanswers.com to find more about the podcast and tons of resources for families and relationships.
Several years ago, when I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, all of us psychologists used to get together and talk about the different branches of mental health that we could specialize in or avoid, depending on what the trends were socially. And it was generally agreed that being a marriage counselor at that point in time was not as important, has as much status as being a psychologist, a counseling or a clinical psychologist, because psychologists were able to handle the most difficult cases. Well, as the years have gone on and I have practiced as a family psychologist, I have the privilege, sometimes a happy privilege, sometimes not, of interviewing and spending time with married couples who are trying to deal with their problems, some of whom have eventually gotten a divorce and tried to solve their marital problems in that way. As those same years have passed, I've read research about what creates divorce and what doesn't, and was surprised to learn that there are quite a few studies which show that approximately 85% of the married couples who think about a divorce and sometimes eventually try it out could have saved their marriage and wish they had have, based on follow-up studies that researchers gathered from collecting information from divorced people. So I wonder if there's any general themes that could work for all couples who are considering divorce, and then if they could learn what those themes were or practices, perhaps they could avoid all of the emotional pain that can come from divorce. Now, I want to insert in this episode today that there are times for divorce, in my opinion, and sometimes I've said to people who have asked for help, I don't know if we can solve this, they will say, and I said, I will try to tell you and be honest with you, based on my experience, whether or not I think your marriage should end. And there have been a few times when I've said, I think it would be best for you to end this. Usually those involved some form of abuse, some emotional disorder, or some long-term mistreatment of some kind where both people condemn each other. I will give you an example. Criticism is where I'm telling you if you're not doing or doing something that I don't like or want you to like or do. Blame is I'm going to make you responsible for it in my own mind. And condemnation is when I know you criticize you and blame you and condemn you as being incompetence or some form of terribly bad individual. So when people condemn each other, that's usually the interaction that precedes divorce action. And so if you were watching, like I've had the opportunity, which is a questionable opportunity to do, then you could say, I can recognize where people are moving steadily toward the possibility of a divorce. Now, in addition to the idea of condemnation, mutually, where each condemn the other, they talk about divorce. And in my experience, sometimes when the language of divorce begins, quite often people talk themselves into it. It's a strange conversation. It's like, well, what are you thinking? Well, will you give me a chance? Well, I'll give you 3 months. Well, at the end of the 3 months, they've made the possibility of divorce a planned consideration activity. Having gone through several divorces with several different couples over the years, and watched what happens to those individuals and to their children. While there are a few divorces that should take place, marriages should end, but most of them could have been saved. And if they'd have known what to do to save them, then they would have avoided their emotional pain and frustration and challenges in life that follow a divorce, and so could their children avoided that. I am very oriented toward children. I've discovered that I have a special orientation toward young people. And so it hurts a lot when they go through parental divorce. And it bothers me as well, just watching them try to survive it. So the purpose for this series called Instead of a Divorce, Try This Out, is to see if I can give you some things I've learned in my 4 decades, more than 4 decades of practice, as a matter of fact, to see if you can do a few things that would save your marriage, or suggestions that you could give people that would help save theirs. So, for example, let's suppose that we address immediately the associative cause. There are probably many causes for a divorce, but one thing almost always exists, in my opinion, unless there are structural or substantive things like I want to have children and she doesn't, or we're never see each other, and etc. What happens is that most people go into marriage and they have to handle some differences. There are general differences, there are cultural differences, and there are family cultural differences. And then there's a certain kind of psychology that each person has. Some individuals are more flexible cognitively and able to handle and adjust, and some are not. And those are some of the attending factors which make a marriage difficult. But a lot of people address those successfully, and some who cannot are those who get a divorce when they didn't need to do it. On other occasions, I've seen one couple harbor anger and frustration over some event that took place sometimes years earlier, sometimes when the spouse wasn't even in the same area and they weren't dating, but they learned about them and it has so affected them that they can't get rid of it. So these people occasionally, whenever they're under stress, bring up the thing that their partner has done sometimes years earlier and just berate them over it, humiliate, remind them, and so on. And both people feel terrible afterwards. So the idea that there are some themes or some formula that can prevent divorce is an important idea, but I need to make a disclaimer of some kind. What prevents a divorce sometimes is not the same thing as the skills of good marital behavior. So it isn't as simple as saying, well, why don't you stop those things and do really good things, and that will enable you to survive your marriage or survive your marital problems. Well, here's the problem for that, and the reason why it is sometimes not successful to believe that. By the time a couple have been married for a while, they have created redundant or repetitive patterns of not only verbal communication, but nonverbal communication and ways of relating with each other and dealing with certain situations. And these habits, once formed, repeat themselves, and they're sort of like a bad script. And you once are an actor in a play, and you have this script, and you just play it out. So when your partner one day says, subject A, you've been trained to say subject B, and your responses go on until there's difficulty between the two of you. So these patterns of bad behavior exist, and one of them is the idea that each person believes that the other one is the cause. This is a strange thing because that idea usually is a function of just the order of communication. So two people cannot communicate at exactly the same time, so they have to take turns. And they each believe that the other person speaks first and therefore is the cause. Well, you said. Well, no, I didn't. You're the one that says, and so that's a common argument. But that's not the basis for a bad marriage or a divorce. What is the idea that I think as a partner that you cause my feelings. You make me unhappy, you make me sad, you irritate me, you do all of these things. I might even try to be graceful in telling you about it, and I might say, well, when you do such and such, then I feel. Now, without realizing, I'm trying to communicate honestly and fairly, but that's still a criticism. And when people believe that each person causes the other, then it creates a mental condition that we know as defensiveness or self-protection. Once this self-protection gets loose in a couple's relationship, it isn't a stable factor. It can increase to more and more things. It generalizes just like anxiety does. When you're anxious and you avoid something, then what you do to avoid it because you're anxious, you also have to avoid later on. And pretty soon, all the things you're afraid of multiply, and you're avoiding this and this and this until pretty soon you just want to stay in your room. Well, defensiveness, because it's anxiety driven, is very much like that. Now, the problem with defensiveness is this. When a person is defensive and self-protective, they neither send their messages accurately, emotionally accurately, nor do they receive the messages from the other person accurately, but neither one knows that. They each think they're saying totally clear, understandable, clear, identifying, amazing words, and they don't get why the other person doesn't understand that. So they perpetuate the idea that they're the victim and the other person is the perpetrator, and both people are functioning that way. The alternative to that is this one. When sometimes each person believes that the other person causes their feelings, a different pattern emerges, which leads to a divorce, and it's where their behavior is opposite. So one person gives lectures, the other person is quiet. One person is clean, the other is messy. One person criticizes, the other admits to having problems. One person seems to grow in assertiveness and power, and the other person grows in weakness and inferiority over time. And that condition usually leads to the possibility of a divorce. And if you were watching that with me, you'd notice that they can change that if they just stop for a minute and said, my goodness, what's going on here is this and this and this, can we talk about it? But they can't do that typically because they're so convinced that the other person is causing what's going on and I'm the victim of that. So with all these things as a precedent toward the possibility of divorce, when the reward value of a relationship gets to be below 50%, that is, if I'm in my marriage and 50% of the time I find reward and positive things, I might stay married. I might also stay married to live out my religious faith or commitments. I might stay married for my children's sake. But typically, once the reward value of a relationship drops below 50%, people get really serious about thinking and actually pursuing a divorce. So with that in mind, then what is it? What is it that begins to turn the marriage around or upends it or eliminates these patterns of interaction that are destructive and makes it possible for people to avoid getting a divorce? Well, having years and years of observation and dozens of couples over the years, I've discovered a few things and I would like to share them with you. So first of all, you could start doing this. You could eliminate all criticism, blame, and condemnation. You don't have to do it. You can control what you say, and you just say, I'm not going to do that any longer. When I say that to couples, they'll say things like, well, then do I have to take everything he says and not respond? Or do I have to just let her do whatever she wants? No. because they're two different things. You just don't criticize or blame or condemn because you have to stop it in order to begin to see and understand what to do to avoid a divorce. So then if you start there, then you think, all right, here's something else I could do. I could try out talking about myself and just myself for a few minutes every day. It would sound something like this. I have been thinking about doing this and going here and so on. Or I want to tell you what love means to me. Now, when you get to the emotions, you have to be careful because if you've been defensive, see, if you said, I've been thinking about what love means to me, your partner will hear that as either they're going to get a lecture and or advice or they're going to be criticized. So you have to caution yourself and your partner by saying, look, I'm going to say a few things about my feelings. I just want to tell you or inform you about them, and I'm not trying to blame or condemn or anything. Then you say, I would like to tell you what happiness is like for me. Then tell an incident where you were happy and say, here's what I felt and here's what I thought. So the goal is to begin to separate yourself from the criticism or condemnation that you send, and then do the same thing for your partner. Now, once you start doing that, lo and behold, you discover that your mind will start opening awarenesses of yourself. And you begin to think, oh, yeah, here's what I do that's not good. And that's a good thing because awareness of your contribution to whatever is bad typically is the harbinger of something that is better. So after you learn to do that for a little while and you're not criticism or blaming or condemning, then you need to consider one thing in addition. There's more, but I'll include those in other episodes. This one has to do with freedom. It amazes me how little people seem to know about the importance of freedom in a relationship. I have learned that freedom is love's aphrodisiac. When you feel free and you allow freedom for your partner, then you are able to feel more love. And when you restrict freedom or yours is restricted, then so is love. Now, people, when I mention this, they'll say, well, then he could do whatever he wants. She could do it. No, that's not what real freedom is. Freedom actually means kind of a feeling that I have about I can think my own thoughts. I can state my opinions and have them be heard. I can do positive things, worthwhile things. In order to help people feel free, I have actually asked them to increase the amount of love and kindness and gratitude, that is the way they show it and express it, before they do anything else so that they can learn that their comments or ideas can be understood as just informing rather than being critical or negative. Now, you might also appreciate that researchers have found that there are two forms of behavior which appear to be essential to resolving differences that lead to a divorce and righting a marital ship. These two forms of behavior are altruism, that is doing something without expecting a reward, and increasing the amount of information that are shared between the two brains in the marriage. This is not difficult to do. You can do grateful things, kind things, marriage loving things, and then also you can increase the flow of information if you want to. Somebody will say, well, he doesn't talk to me, or she won't talk to me. Well, that's not a good thing. But when you have an opportunity, you might try saying, I've been thinking about, stay away from the marriage at first, and just talk about something that is in your mind or in your life or so on. And when there's a lot of bitterness, that's not going to help, and so on. And it may even be suspected, and at least your partner may be skeptical while you're doing it. But you could also go and say, I would just like you to tell me about this situation and I'll listen. And if your partner will communicate, then avoid responding to criticism or blame. Listen all the way through at the end, bite your tongue and listen all the way through the end and then say, thank you, I think I understand that, and thank you for sharing. So thank your partner, Steve, for the opportunity of talking. I repeat, It's acts of altruism, and it is increase the flow of communication or information between the two people in the relationship. Well, okay, so far I've identified some things that you could do instead of getting a divorce. I would like there to be fewer divorces, and I'd like to start getting fewer right away, because I, like many mental health professionals, have seen way too many of them and way too much pain in the lives of children and the adults who go through that unhappy experience.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the First Answers podcast, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids, with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Find First Answers on Facebook, and remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the Podcasts app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about First Answers. Check out another podcast by Dr. Scoresby called The Christ Questions, which is centered on questions we ask about Jesus Christ and questions he asks us. Dr. Scoresby examines how Christians can build faith in Jesus Christ that lasts and discover the true blessings and rewards for believing.